Okay. Good morning, everyone. Officially, welcome to Monday. There's Kwan. Morning, Kwan. Welcome to Monday. Yeah, how's the weekend? Okay. Good morning. Anybody do anything fun on the weekend?
We just have Sunday because we are on quarantine. We were on quarantine
Yeah.
Saturday. We just yesterday hanging out.
So yesterday was like first day out?
Yes.
Yeah? How'd that feel?
It was good.
Yeah, it was good. Yeah, I bet. Although it was a bit of a rainy day. Well, I guess later in the day it was pretty rainy, hey? But yeah, it's nice to be outside again, hey? Okay. So people went outside. What else did people do? You worked? Victoria, where do you work? Where do you work? The what?
A Turkish restaurant.
Okay. How's it working there?
That's nice. Pretty busy.
Yeah? Okay. That's good. Okay, so the working was done. Just going outside was done. Sleeping was done. Anything else? No? Low key? Low key weekend? Okay. You guys are all so exciting. All right, so Vito is here and Shota's here, so good morning to you too. And Kayla's here too. Good morning, Kayla. Okay, let's jump in. So, apologize for Friday. I couldn't be here because there was something I had to do that I couldn't do at any other time. And so I had to take care of it, but it's taken care of, so not to worry. I'm sure you were all sad and heartbroken that I wasn't here and that you couldn't. Yeah, right. Aw. You were just like, oh. Did you almost cry? Oh, Victoria, it's okay. Okay. Well, regardless, here I am. So you don't have to worry anymore. Where were we? Oh, yes. On Thursday, we were talking about the Sumerians, and we watched a section of a documentary, which I think was pretty good. As I say, finding a good documentary on the Sumerians is difficult because half of the people are interested in the Bible and half of the people are interested in aliens, and very few people are just like looking at the civilization as it is. So it was nice to find one that kind of does that. We said that these are kind of one of the first people to show up in Mesopotamia. They're one of the first people on the planet to start creating cities, and over time these cities grow, and some of them to a point where they have 800,000 to 1 million people, and that's huge, right? Because remember, we said that before agriculture, we were estimating there was about 5 to 8 million people on the entire planet, right? Now we have cities that actually might have 1 million people in themselves, right? So human populations have gone, right, have started to go way up in some parts of the world, especially this one. And so, yeah, we said that there were a bunch of city-states that were created, Uruk and Eridu and these other kinds. And we said that they were, oh yeah, I've got a nice little map here. And you can see they're all kind of sprinkled throughout this area we call Mesopotamia, right? So all around the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, there are these ancient cities that are starting to appear, right? And so, again, the bigger ones might have looked something like this. Again, it's difficult for us to know for sure because lots of them were made with, and we'll see this shortly, lots of them were made with mud brick. And mud brick was very easy to manufacture. The Mesopotamians had a lot of mud to work with, and so they built with these bricks, but they don't preserve quite as well as stone does, right? So things that are carved out of stone, they preserve for thousands of years. Mud brick, not quite so great, right? So we have a lot of kind of ruined cities, but again, we imagine that they might have looked something like this. We said in the middle there were these ziggurats, right? These temples to the gods, and we said that there were these weren't temples that everybody went into. They were temples that really only the priest or kind of religious practitioners went into. What did we say about Mesopotamian religion? It wasn't monotheistic. What was it? Polytheistic, yeah. So which meant more than one God. Yeah. So these guys have many, many gods that they worship. Right? We read this section of the textbook, and we talked about the Sumerian social structure. And I think you told me that there were all kinds of different people in this society, right? There were certainly most people were farmers, right? So most of the population were farmers, but there were slaves, there were bureaucrats and scribes and government officials and merchants and craftspeople and priests. Who else was there? Soldiers, well, kind of, maybe. Who else was there? There were probably prostitutes floating around. Who? Slaves, yep. We had slaves. Other what? Yeah, okay, yeah. So there's a ton of different classes and different types of jobs people can have, right? And that's part of that craft specialization thing, right? The idea that, yeah, before intensive agriculture, everybody farmed, right? Or before that, everybody hunted and gathered, right? But now we have people who specialize in different things, right? They have different jobs to do. What's cuneiform? Something related to writing? Okay, you're not wrong. Yeah, they're writing, that's their writing system, right? So the Sumerians develop it, and then other cultures that come later, they use this writing system, right? And why are they able to use this writing system so easily? Because what? Yes, but I mean later cultures. Why would they use the same writing system? Different language.
It works, right?
Because what?
Because it works.
Because it works?
Yeah.
Why does it work?
Ask the people who created it.
Okay. Yeah, what did it look like? What did this writing look like? Yeah. Yeah, they wrote in clay, right? So they had a hunk of clay in their hand, and they had this wedge-shaped reed or piece of wood, and you would kind of like stick it into the clay, right? And that was how you created shapes, right? Impress, I think, would be the word you would use. I think engraving is like it's technical terms. Yeah, when you engrave, you're kind of like scraping, but I think with this one, you're actually impressing. So you're just kind of like pushing it into the clay, I think. Yeah, and so each symbol represented each symbol represented not a word. Yeah, which represented If I said that this writing system was phonetic, what does that mean? Yeah. So it's a writing system that encodes meaning through sound, right? Phone is for sound, right? So each character represents a certain sound. It's not like other written languages around the world where each symbol represents an idea, right? Or a concept or a thing. So it's all sound-based. And so later cultures were able to use it because even though their language was totally different, you just write it with different sounds, right? You use the characters for the sounds, and you can write out your own language in it, right? And we still do that with English today, right? The characters that we use are, our writing script is actually shared by different languages, and you can write any number of languages with the same script that we use in English. Sometimes really easily, sometimes it doesn't quite work out very well because the sounds are different, but you can sort of still do it. Why is this writing so important?
Archaeologists could find many important stuff from the past that they cannot find now.
Exactly, right? We can discover things about this culture that we could not discover in any other way, right? So again, archaeology can sometimes tell you what people did, sometimes, but it can't tell you why they did it. And it can't tell you what they were thinking about and what they felt and what they believed, right? Archaeology can't really tell you that unless you can read what these people write, right? And fortunately, we can, right? Amazingly enough, we can read what these people wrote thousands of years ago. Do you remember any of the things that we learned from Sumerian writing? Prayers, legends, financial records. Yeah, lots of writing is unfortunately like tax paperwork. Right, we have a king list, which is very interesting and useful. What else do we have? Poems? Yeah. We have probably the first great work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Oh yeah, we have some architectural writings that talk about how things were designed and built. What else? Oh, yeah, we have business records. What else do we have? What's that? Legend, yeah. We have all of that stuff, right? And again, all of that stuff is information you can't get any other way, right? So writing is kind of critical for the Sumerians, right? Because it allows them to do certain things, right? But it also allows us to know what they were thinking and feeling and believing, right? So, yeah, so this is this cuneiform writing style. We have lots and lots of writing from this period of time and from this culture. This is just one example of some Sumerian writing, and you can see here that it's just a piece of clay, and they've kind of pushed these symbols into it. And as I mentioned, it's very useful for archaeologists because clay, if you fire it, preserves really, really well, right? It's basically indestructible. But again, if you write on paper doesn't preserve very well, right? It dries out and crumbles, and eventually there's nothing left, right? But clay preserves very, very well, and yeah, we can clearly read what these people wrote. One thing I wanted to point out to you here, and it's not really in the textbook, but it's an idea that's worth thinking about, is that one of the things that's happening in the modern world, and I guess this ties into our kind of week reflecting on, Indigenous people in Canada and that situation, is the loss of languages, right? And so as we kind of become a more globalized society, there are some languages that are becoming bigger, right? More people are speaking them. And then there are some languages that are becoming smaller, right? Fewer people are speaking them. And so this, of course, happens because as we become more globalized, we need to interact with people all around the globe. And so what kind of languages do we use? What are the kind of big global languages that we have now? English is one. French and Spanish to some degree, yeah. What? Chinese, Mandarin, yeah, definitely huge language. What else? Arabic, yeah. Vietnamese? I don't know how big that is, but maybe in Southeast Asia. It's so big? Yeah, okay. What's that? Hindi, yeah. So there are these kind of big languages, right? Like English, French, maybe German, Spanish, Hindi, Arabic, Mandarin, maybe Russian, to some degree. Lots of people speak Russian, or at least a big. Yeah, maybe Turkey a little bit. There's these big languages, but then other languages are kind of becoming small and disappearing, right? Because if you want to do business or if you want to go anywhere else in the world, there are kind of these languages that you need to know, right? And, you know, people don't worry too much about speaking Danish, right? Because nobody speaks Danish, right? If you go to Denmark, yes, but outside of Denmark, nobody speaks it, right? And so people from Denmark will learn Danish, but they'll also learn a bigger language, right? Because they have to interact with other people in the world. And as they do, we start to lose some of these smaller languages, right? They start to disappear. And many of you might say, well, whatever, who cares? But it's worth kind of paying attention to. And maybe one of the reasons that I'll suggest here is because of this Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And so these two guys, one guy named Wharf and the other guy named Sapir, I forget what his first name was, they were suggesting that the language that you speak, and maybe the first language you know or the language you know best, it actually using that language and thinking in that language actually changes the way you think. Okay, so think about this for a second. So who in this room, I know the answer to this, but who in this room speaks more than one language? You all do, right? You all do. So everyone in this room speaks a different language. Now, would you agree with me that when you're trying to, let's say, move from saying something in English to saying something in your first language, or the other way around, can you translate like word for word, or does it kind of not work? You have to kind of like think of the thing you want to say and then say it in that language. Yeah, they don't sort of, the languages aren't sort of totally equal, right? They divide up the world differently, right? And so the way you express meaning in one language is just not quite the same as the way you express it in another. And so going from one language to another isn't just a matter of, okay, this is the word for dog in English, so I'll just change it to the word for dog in my language. It's not just word for word, it's meaning, right? And sometimes you have to think about what you want to say in that language in order to say it, because it just doesn't translate perfectly. And that's kind of what Sapir-Whorf is saying here, is that because languages divide up the world differently, and because when you're thinking in a particular language, thinking in that language results in you kind of seeing the world a little bit differently, right? You imagine the world differently based on the language that you're thinking in, right? And therefore, every language around the world, small or big, is actually a unique human way of seeing the world, right? To see the world through the lens of the Vietnamese language is not the same as when you see it through Mandarin, right? Or Farsi, or Swahili, or Japanese, or English, or Spanish, or Italian, right? All of those are kind of unique ways of seeing the world. And so when a language disappears, you're not just losing a language, you're losing a unique way of imagining what the world is like, right? A unique way in which humans have created meaning, right? And so you can see there's kind of an overlap with culture there, right? Where language is very important in creating meaning, because how else can you communicate what something means except through language, right? So the way your language works, the way that it imagines things, the way that it communicates meaning is an important part of culture and an important part of the way that humans understand their experience. And so, yeah, to lose one is a big deal, right? And unfortunately, we are losing languages because because we're becoming more globalized, and some languages are becoming so big that everyone is speaking them, right? And here we are, all of you, we're speaking English, right? And because that's a language in which well, that's what we speak here in Canada, but that's a language in which we can all communicate with each other, right? So it's happening right now. Did that make some sort of sense? It's kind of an interesting idea, and it's an interesting thing to think about, how thinking in one language and thinking in another is actually quite a different experience, right? It creates a slightly different reality for you. Right. So on Thursday, we watched a section of this documentary, and we answered a few questions about the video. Can we just kind of rapid fire these really quickly? What was so important about the silt in Mesopotamia? What's that? I cannot hear anything. Yes, that's why I just want to do them really quick. Oh, we didn't answer them, or we did?
No, we did answer it, and then it was like info and info.
Oh, so I'm confused. We did or we did not?
We did.
We did? Okay, I just want to do them really quick, because we did them already.
And how the Mesopotamians find that or golden crops.
Right. So that silt was kind of nutrient rich, right? It washed down out of the mountains, it flooded onto their fields, and it helped fertilize the soil, right? So that their plants would grow. So that was super important. I'll take this one. The Mesopotamians during the Ubaid period, which is the period kind of before the civilizations of Sumer, they kind of discovered farming, right? Or they started to grow their own crops. And so in the Ubaid period, we find early farming, right? Simple farming villages before intensive agriculture, before food surplus, before the big cities, right? We said that they were growing all kinds of things. You remember what they were growing? What's that? Yeah, they were yeah. What else?
Corn.
I don't think they're growing corn. I think corn comes from North and South America. So I don't think they're growing corn. Yeah, they're growing things like wheat and barley and millet. Those crops come from this part of the world. What's that? Dates, yeah, from date palms, pomegranates, garlic, probably onions of some type, root vegetables probably of some type. So all kinds of grapes. Did they mention grapes? Yeah, they're growing grapes. So yeah, they're growing these crops, but they're growing all kinds of fruits and vegetables as well, right? And again, this part of the world, if you can keep your crops watered, it's great, right? Lots of sun, lots of warmth, and it will, it'll help grow your crops, right?
Like saffron.
Saffron?
Yes.
I guess it does come from that part. Where does saffron come from?
Iran.
Does it come from Iran?
Yeah.
Yeah? Then I suspect they were.
I can say it's invented from Iran. Like the tree is like that.
Yeah?
But some countries like now and grow the saffron.
Yeah. I thought it was important in Indian cooking as well, I thought. But maybe that came later, or maybe it grows there too. Or maybe I'm just wrong.
We use it.
Yeah?
The Spanish.
Oh, right. I wonder if it grows in different places. I wonder if it grew in different places and different kind of cultures used it in their food. But saffron would have been one for sure. And yeah, they would have grown other things too, right? Like herbs and things like that to mix in with their food. So lots of different agricultural foods are being grown here. There was 2 people. Do you remember the 2 people? Can't remember the names?
One is Sumerians.
Nope.
Sumerians.
Sumerians are one, and
The other is
Acadians. There we go. So yeah, the Acadians or the Acadians, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, in the north, and then the Sumerians in the south. Now, they said that Sumerian language was a language isolate. Do you remember what that meant? It almost sounds like what it is. Isolate. Do you remember what that meant? Yeah, so all the languages in that part of the world are Semitic languages, right? So they're related to each other by their general structure or their grammar or some of their words. And so, not at this time, but later, languages like Arabic will evolve from this, and Aramaic and Hebrew. All those languages will kind of evolve from these early Semitic languages, but the Sumerian language is different, right? It's not a Semitic language, it's something else, right? So what might that suggest about the Sumerians? That they're different and not necessarily. Yeah, it might suggest that they have originally came from somewhere else, right? Because again, this is an area that speaks Semitic languages, but then there's these Sumerians that are there that are speaking a language that is not a Semitic language, right? So they're from somewhere else. We're not really sure exactly from where, but their language is different, right? Their language is not related to the languages that exist. Ooh, okay, this might be tricky to remember. Who is Owanus? Do you remember Owanus? I'll give you a hint. He was a half man, half fish.
Fish teach the people like something.
He what?
He teach the people like something.
He taught the people something, yeah? Yeah, he's kind of this like demigod type thing, right? He's like this supernatural being. He comes from the ocean. He's half man, half fish. We'll get to that in a second. I think did they show him like, did he have like a fish and then a man's body sticking out of the top of him, or
Like a fish body and like human.
and a human head?
No, like human.
Oh, like torso.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's weird, hey? Okay, so he had like a fish body with a human torso sticking out of the top. That's bizarre. So Owanus comes from the sea, and yeah, he teaches people about civilization, right? He teaches them how to farm and how to cultivate, right? He taught men, wisdom, right? So it's kind of this origin story about this supernatural being coming and teaching humans how to do things. And lots of cultures have something like this, right? There's some kind of creature or supernatural being that comes to Earth and teaches humans how to do things, right? How to farm, how to fish, how to live together, how to build, right? Lots of cultures have something like this. It's not always, a fish man. Sometimes it's something else, but it's a very kind of common theme, right?
Did people creating like a god?
What's that?
Did there like people creating like a god?
Oh, it's possible. It's possible that they would have. Sometimes gods like this are seen as kind of like friends of mankind.
They thought someone come from the oceans to study us.
Well, yeah, I mean, in kind of world mythology, like this is kind of like a helper figure, right? So in Greece, for instance, they have Prometheus, right? And Prometheus loves humans, and so he steals fire from the gods and brings it to people so that people can use it to keep themselves warm and to cook their food and things like that. And so Prometheus kind of loves humans so much that he wants to help them, right? So maybe Owanus is kind of similar, right? He really likes humans, and so he goes onto land to sort of help humans along, right? To teach them things. So yeah, they might have worshipped Owanus or, you know, prayed to him for certain things. I think that's possible. Okay, and last one, they talked about a flood story. Do you remember the flood story? What? A hint? There was a flood.
Wow.
What do you want? What about the flood story? Well, it's a story, and it's about a flood. What? Can I give you more of a hint? This is pretty interesting, though, is it not? Because is anyone familiar with the Christian or the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible? Is there a flood story in there? Yeah, there's the whole Noah's Ark thing, right? God tells Noah that he's going to flood the world, and so Noah builds this gigantic boat, right? And he herds all the animals onto it. God brings the flood. I think it's for 40 days and 40 nights. The boat floats, and then eventually the flood goes down, and the animals come out, and they kind of repopulate the world, right? And what's kind of interesting is that the Sumerians have kind of a similar story, right? A similar story about a flood that is thousands of years older than the Bible is, right? So the Sumerians have a flood story of their own. But do you remember the interesting thing that the documentary suggested about this flood story? And about Owanus? Say again? Well, it had to do with, it had to do with this. And so this is kind of what this part of the world looked like before the end of the last ice age. So there's not really, so you can see there's a lot of rivers up there in Mesopotamia, but really what you're looking at is the Persian Gulf. But the Gulf isn't there yet because the sea levels are quite a bit lower, right? There's lots of ice still in the northern part of the world. So the sea level is lower, and so we don't have a Persian Gulf, we just have the rivers, right? And the Tigris and the Euphrates flow through Mesopotamia, but then they join and they follow that course all the way out to the Indian Ocean. But the documentary says that what happened is that as the ice age kind of ended and the Earth's temperature warmed and the ice melted, sea levels started to rise, right? And so it started to fill that area. And the documentary suggested that it was actually filling that area at the rate of about 1 meter a day, right? And so they were suggesting for the people of, for the people living in this part of the world, they might be living by the river, but the next day the river is like 1 meter further in than it used to be, and then the day after, and then the day after. And so wouldn't it be easy for these people to think like, oh God, is the world flooding? Like, are we all going to be underwater because, this is the place that we live, and every day the water is getting higher and higher? Are we going to be completely submerged? Are we all going to drown, right? And again, for us looking at this, it's like, no, you're not going to drown. The world is a big place. But for people living, 10,000 years ago, would they have known that? Maybe not, right? This might have been a really scary event to see the land that they had lived in and hunted in and farmed in being flooded every day by this, by this encroaching water. And that's a lot of water, right? The Persian Gulf is pretty big, right? And so they suggested that maybe the flood comes from this event, right? The story of the flood comes from the filling of the Persian Gulf 10 or 14,000 years ago. Maybe probably closer to 14, I think. And who would have come into the southern part of Mesopotamia but maybe these Sumerian people who used to live in this river valley, right? Now being flooded out and pushed north, and then they arrive in Mesopotamia from the sea, right? They come from a land that's underwater, just like Owanus, right? And even though they didn't have fish bodies or whatever, maybe their arrival in this land is kind of remembered through the myth, right? And myths are like that, right? They're not entirely factual. Sometimes they're symbolic. Sometimes they carry meaning in a symbolic way. And so maybe this event has something to do with the flood story, but also with the Owanus story, right? And the arrival of the Sumerians in this part of the world. Maybe. We can't prove it, right? We don't know for sure, but kind of an interesting idea, yeah? I don't know.
Now we have like 3 or 4 countries just in like Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
It's like invent like Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, and these countries. And they generate lots of oil from Persian Gulf.
Hmm. Yeah, it's oil-wise, it's a very rich part of the world, right? And this part of the world will undergo a lot of change, right? Because we don't have time to get into it, but the Sumerians will kind of start out the sort of civilization in this area, but then the Acadians will come, and then the Neo-Babylonians will come, and then the Hittites, and then the Persian Empire, and then the Macedonians and the Greeks and the Romans and the Arabs. And so there's all these kind of layers of civilizations that will kind of conquer. The Egyptians will conquer this part of the world for a little while. And so we kind of have all these layers of influence and civilization, right? And so even when we come to places like, Abu Dhabi and Kuwait and Iran and, countries that are, or Iraq, sorry, that are in that area of the world now, of course they're very recent, but they're preceded by many, many layers of history with different cultures kind of existing in that part of the world. And so, yeah, there's kind of a lot we're starting at the beginning with the Sumerians, and then the end point is, places like Iraq and Kuwait and Abu Dhabi, but there's so much in between, right, that's going to happen in this part of the world. Is there a legend about the water? Well, I don't know for sure. The flood might be the legend, but for the most part it happens very early, right? So the first writing that we have on the entire planet is probably about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. And this happens probably about 7,000 years before that. So any mention of this filling of the Persian Gulf will be like in people's ancient memory, so far back that nobody remembers it anymore. Because think of the distance between yes, but later, but much later. So because this Persian Gulf will fill around, let's say it fills around 14,000 years ago. The Sumerians invent writing 7,000 years after that, and then 7,000 years after that brings us to right now. So, so the length of time between the filling of the Gulf and the beginning of writing is basically the length of time from the Sumerians to us. So it's a long time. If this stuff gets written down, it's because it's been passed down orally by word of mouth for thousands of years. And again, as you know, has anyone ever played that game, that telephone game as a kid? You all sit in a circle and somebody whispers a phrase into your ear, but they only whisper it once, and then you have to pass it on to the next person. And if you didn't hear it right, it doesn't matter. You just have to pass on what you think you heard. And then it goes all the way around the circle, and then the last person says what they think the phrase is, and it's totally changed from what it was at the beginning. Yeah, so there's a little bit of that happening too, right? When people pass things down orally, they forget things, they, add new details, they get rid of details, they think it'll be a better story if they tell it this way, and so things change, right? Things kind of evolve. Yeah. Are we all good? I think that's so interesting. I think that's such an interesting idea. There's no way to prove it, but it's an interesting idea. Oh yeah, okay. Okay, I'm going to talk about this and then I'll give you a bit of a break, okay? So we're going to spend a little more time with religion when we talk about the Egyptians. And so I'm just going to introduce religion here, but we'll dig into it a little more deeply in the next section, okay? But we probably should say that this is our first glimpse into human religion, right? Religion is belief-based, right? It's based on beliefs, it's based on symbols, it's based on ideas, and we need those things written down. So we assume, and I think we're probably correct to assume, that people had religion for thousands and thousands of years before this. But of course, we don't know anything about it, right? This is the first one that is actually written down that we know about. Good morning. And so we know that there are many gods, and that the Mesopotamians and the Sumerians felt that their lives depended on the gods, right? The gods had to bless them and to think well of them, and if they didn't, things were going to go badly, right? So you had to stay on the good side of the gods. You had to give the appropriate offerings, right? You had to say the appropriate prayers, because if you didn't, then you wouldn't get the blessing of the gods, and then things were not going to go very well for you at all, right? So the gods were kind of prayed to, they were sacrificed to, right? You gave gifts to the gods. And again, if you offended the gods, they would punish you, right? And maybe your crop would fail, maybe there would be a drought or a famine or something like that, or the river would flood unexpectedly and destroy your farm, right? So you really had to stay on the right side of the gods, right? If the gods were not respected and sacrificed to, then they would punish you, right? There's also in Mesopotamia, and we'll hear about shortly, there's also lots of demons and monsters. And so this is a world populated by gods and goddesses, but also demons and monsters, okay? And we'll hear about some of those. Oh, actually, I think a little bit later today, because we're going to talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh, okay? And again, there's hundreds and hundreds of gods. I won't introduce them to you. There's probably about 12 that are the big ones, okay? There's about 12. It's kind of like ancient Greece. There's kind of 12 main gods. Same thing with the Mesopotamians. They have kind of 12 important ones. But then, as you can see, they had lots of little ones that were in charge of tiny little things like making bread and pottery and things like that too. Each city was protected by its own god. So those big ziggurats in the middle of the city were the home of the god that protected the city, and they had different gods depending on what city you went to. And again, most of those offerings at the temple were made by the priests, right? So some individual people could do a little offering or a prayer, but the temples were kind of maintained by the priests, and most people never got a chance to go in. What's that? Yeah.
Mesopotamian area, like now means years.
Well, it's kind of not. It's not a term that gets used too much anymore, because it's an old Greek term, and so it's a description of that part of the world, kind of before there's any other kind of empire or country that exists there, and so I think it'll remain Mesopotamia until a little bit later on it'll become known as Persia. And so the ancient world will start to think of this area as Persia, but not yet, right? So the ancient world will think of this area as Mesopotamia until the Persian Empire, and then it will kind of be known as Persia. And then a little bit later on, it will become Iraq and Iran and so on and so forth. But so it's kind of an older term for this part of the world. but seeing as we're in the ancient world right now, that's what we're using. Yeah, so the gods are all associated with natural phenomenon, right? And so this is a way in which people can understand the world. 10,000 years ago, people don't understand, they don't understand the cloud cycle, right? They don't understand evaporation and condensation and precipitation. They don't understand that. But they can understand a god who controls it, right? So they can take something that they don't understand and they personify it, right? They create some sort of being that controls it, because that they can understand, right? They don't understand the science, they don't understand the way the world works, but they can envision a god controlling it somehow. And so that's kind of how people explain things that they can't explain. They think of it as the workings of a god.
So they are the ones who create God.
What's that?
They are the ones who create God.
Mesopotamians or humans? Well, for those of you who are religious, don't take offense to this, because this will be how an anthropologist looks at it. But an anthropologist would say that religion is man-made, right? As are the gods. The gods are created by humans. And so all humans create their own gods. The Mesopotamians had theirs, the Egyptians had theirs, the Romans had theirs, and people before the Mesopotamians would have had gods too. We don't know who those gods were or what they were like, because this is the first kind of official record we have of them. But yeah, these are the gods that the Mesopotamians created, right? What do you think influences the type of gods that people create? And again, this is not, if you're religious, don't take offense. This is beside. we're taking religion and putting it aside and just looking at this kind of stuff. But what do you think influences the type of gods that the Mesopotamians created?
I think it's retreats to control the people. It's for a government to control people with their religions or behavior.
Yeah. We'll probably get to that next week, but yeah, religion is an excellent means of social control, right? Especially if you're a government, right? If you want to get people to do what you want them to do, tell them that the God said so, right? And if the God says so, you kind of have to do it, right? So, yeah, so governments and also kings, ancient kings and rulers, would use religion to do this, right? Because if you can convince people that the God said so, you pretty much got to do it. Yeah. Yeah. And so, any other kind of ideas about what would influence the Mesopotamians in creating their gods? Right. So depending on the kind of things that were going on that you might want to explain, you might create a god that would control that, right? Yeah. Okay. Let's not get too deep into that, because there will be more on that later. I absolutely promise you. And the last thing we'll maybe say is that their idea of the afterlife is kind of not very clear, right? So I think, those of us who are Christian have some idea of what, heaven might look like, or an afterlife. Those of us who are Muslim might have some sort of idea of what paradise looks like as well. The Mesopotamians seem not to have had much of an idea about what happened after death. And so they had this idea of this kind of like dark, gloomy place that everyone went to, where people were like eating ashes, and it was all very dark and horrible. And so their idea of what happens after death is kind of, it's a bit of a downer. It's not something to look forward to, strangely enough. Yeah, but that's kind of all I'll say about that. Okay, let's take a little break. When we come back, we'll talk about the very first piece of literature that we've ever read in the history of human civilization, and then we'll talk about maybe what we can learn from that story. Okay, but story time when we get back. Story time. Okay. All right, we are back. So, let me just see what slide I'm going to jump to here. Oh, yeah, okay.
Oh, wow.
There we go. So, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is a guy, okay? He's the hero of our story. So, we said, of course, that ancient Sumerian writing has given us access to prayers and poems and financial records and songs and things that people were thinking and feeling. And one of those things is actually the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, our earliest version of this story comes from a bit of a later period, but the story was probably told in ancient Sumerian culture as well. And again, it's basically our first work of literature, okay? Because again, before this, nothing was written down, so any kind of stories that people had, they were kind of lost, right? I'm sure people told stories before that. I'm sure that they were sitting around campfires telling the same stories over and over. But this is the first evidence we have of what those stories actually looked like, okay? And so Gilgamesh here is in the story, he's the semi-mythic king of Uruk. So Uruk is one of those Sumerian city-states. I say semi-mythic because he's actually on that king's list that Felicia mentioned earlier. So there actually is a king Gilgamesh listed. He probably didn't do all the things that you'll hear about in the story, but there was a king Gilgamesh that maybe inspired this story. Who knows? So in the story here, he is a demigod. So he's someone who's like half god, half human, right? So they normally have one of their parents is a god, their other parent is a mortal person. Any other demigods you can think of? Anybody know of any demigods? Half human, half divine? Give you a hint? You're all about the hints, eh? Ancient Greece. Yeah. Well, no, because most of them are gods, but any demigods, half gods. Hercules, demigod, half god, half man. Achilles, if you've ever seen that old movie Troy with Brad Pitt. Achilles is a demigod. Thor is a demigod, is he not? He's a son of Odin, but is his mom a god? I don't think she is. I think his mom is kind of a regular. Well, she's an Asgardian, but I think she's a regular person. So I think Thor is a demigod. I think. What's that?
Odin, not a half god. Like a half god.
Yeah, they're a half god.
Odin?
Odin, I think Odin is a full.
No, I just know Odin from Viking says.
Oh, okay. Okay, I was thinking of clearly Norse mythology, right? But I was thinking of him more from the Marvel universe. But anyway, so Gilgamesh is this kind of demigod guy. He lives for a long time. The king list says he's king for 126 years, which is probably a little bit untrue. But he's in the story. He has like superhuman strength. So he is like Thor in that way. He is like Hercules in that way. He's more than human, right? He's more than human. Here's a statue of him. You can see how powerful he is. He's got a lion in a headlock. I don't think he would have been. I think this is just sort of symbolic-wise. He might have been a little bit taller than most people. I'm not sure. But you can see how powerful he is, right? If you're headlocking a lion, you're a strong guy. And here's kind of part of the writing, or part of what the Epic of Gilgamesh would have looked like just to read it. But fortunately, we're not going to read it. we're going to have the story kind of told to us. So, did I go too far? Oh yeah, here's what I want you to do. We're going to watch this video, and in the video, this guy, Mike Rugnetta, is going to tell us the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh, okay? It's a strange story. I used to have students read it, but it's quite bizarre in some ways, and in a lot of ways it won't really make sense to you anyway, but we'll watch it, and this is what I want you to pay attention to, okay? What can we tell about the ancient Sumerians from this myth, right? What can we tell about them? Because this is a myth, right? This is a myth, and this is what we'll say that myths are, okay? So myths are stories that are passed down from generation to generation. They usually contain an element of the fantastic. So there are supernatural forces, or there's gods, or humans are superhumans, or something like that, right? There's something outside of the ordinary. And usually they contain some sort of lesson or moral. There's something we're supposed to learn from the myth, right? There's a teaching in it, okay? So we'll watch this little video here. We'll try to figure out what maybe the lesson is, or what are we supposed to learn from this myth. How might the Sumerians see the world based on what the story is like? And what does it mean to be a hero? Because Gilgamesh is the hero of this story. So, is that thunder? Cool. We don't have thunderstorms here very often, but it'd be interesting if we did. And then what is a hero? Okay? Cool? Everybody good? Okay, let's watch this. So, online people, the link is in Microsoft Teams, as are the questions. We'll watch the video, and then we'll come back here right afterwards and discuss what we've seen, okay? So we'll see you in just a few minutes. All right. So there's a lot going on there. It's kind of a weird story, is it not? A little bit weird, right? There's some strange things that happen. There are, of course, some gods and goddesses and creatures that we are not familiar with. What does this tell us about the ancient Mesopotamians? What does a story like this tell us? What kind of strikes you as interesting? I did not hear that, Felicia, but what was it? Okay, so there's maybe there's a value here, or something they're trying to tell each other about learning from their mistakes, right? Because Gilgamesh makes them, even though he's more than human, right? He's greater than a human. He's halfway to a god, and yet he still screws it up sometimes, right? What else? What else kind of stands out to you in a story like this? I heard respective communication? Limitation. Yeah, so there's that. Gilgamesh is kind of, he has to accept his limitations in the story, right? And again, I think that's significant because his limitations are greater than ours, right? He's supposed to be more than us, right? And yet he still has the same kind of weakness and limitation that we all have, right? And so maybe this idea about understanding, the limits of human power, right? What are we really able to do, and accepting that, right? What else? What else can we? What's that?
They believe in God and immortality.
Right. So we know that humans are mortal, right? We know that they die. We know that gods are immortal, right? That they never die. And then there's this guy that's kind of halfway in between, and he strives for immortality but doesn't really achieve it, right? And so it kind of, I guess it underlines the idea that humans are mortal, right? Because even those that are greater than us, they're mortal as well, right? And so all of us, and Utnapishtim says that, right? He says mankind is cut down like reeds in a reed bed, right? It is inevitable, right? That death is inevitable. What else can we learn? If a goddess is flirting with you, do not say no, because they don't like it when you refuse them. What's that? Why? Well, I think they are probably. Well, actually, that's a good point, and it was in a slide earlier, but I might have missed it. The Mesopotamian gods are interesting because they're very human in their behavior, right? So, if you're used to a monotheistic religion like Islam or Christianity, we kind of think about God as this perfect being, right? He's always good and he's just and he knows everything. But the Mesopotamian gods are not like that. They're very imperfect, right? Sometimes they're childish, sometimes they're jealous, sometimes they're angry, sometimes they cheat on their wives, sometimes they're just annoyed, so they do something for the spite of it. They're kind of very human, right? And again, in our major kind of monotheistic religions today, we don't think of God being childish, right? God is a perfect being kind of thing, right? And he's this sort of source of love or power or wisdom or however you want to think about it. But the Mesopotamians see their gods as very human in their behavior, right? And so, again, Ishtar kind of flirts with Gilgamesh and sort of proposes to him. Gilgamesh says thanks. I think I'm going to stay single for a while. I need to focus on me, right? Ishtar gets angry. She sends the bull of heaven to kill Gilgamesh. He kills the bull, and then Enkidu disgraces the goddess, and she strikes him down, right? And so that's kind of strange too, right? We don't usually have conflicts with the god in this kind of way, right? But
Actually, she was not human. Actually, she was goddess.
no, yeah, she is. She's a full-on goddess, right?
So we can focus on her himself when he married with her.
True. I was just joking about the focusing on himself thing, but yeah. So she's a goddess, but of course it's interesting because she's all powerful. She's the goddess of love. She proposes to Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh is like, no, I'm going to pass, right? So she doesn't really get what she wants. And then she attempts to kill Gilgamesh, but she doesn't get what she wants again, right? He kills the bull rather than the bull killing him, right? So she's kind of like unsuccessful, right? She's kind of been scorned, she's angry, and then she can't seem to take revenge on Gilgamesh like she wants, right? And again, if you think of, if you think of Islam or Christianity, you don't really get into a conflict with God or with Allah like that, right? It doesn't really work that way, right? And so it's kind of a different conception of what gods are supposed to be like, right?
He just would like to experience God, that experience like the other people, other humans, God's experience, and then because of these reasons, he could make himself better and more stronger than other humans.
Maybe.
If at all she helped her, then he could not get any experiences about the life.
Yeah, and I wonder why he says no. I don't know if it says it in the original story. I don't remember an explanation of why he says no. Why do you think he says no?
That goddess is
He just doesn't want.
Maybe what?
He just doesn't want.
He just doesn't. He's just not that into her. I don't know.
or that mysterious and
Maybe.
Maybe to have the same lifestyle.
Like his father.
Maybe. I don't know. She's a goddess of love, though. Like, if you're going to marry any god, that's the one. Right? You don't want to marry the god of war. I mean, that's not going to be. What's that? You think he, maybe. True, yeah. Maybe he wanted to hang out with his best friend, bros before. Never mind. I'm not gonna say it. Who knows, right? Who knows?
Something from the Greeks, I think, that whenever they succeed in their life goals, when they marry with God, and they sacrifice animals for God to be like happiness God. Is it like true?
Would he have done that, or did people do that?
I think the people do it.
Sure. Yeah, they absolutely would have, right? So they would sacrifice things to the gods, right? So either to feed them or to send them a gift, right? And so, yeah, you'd often see that they'll sacrifice, animals to the gods to sort of feed them, but also to say, look, we're going to give this to you. This is our best.
Sometimes they sacrifice their people.
Sometimes, depending on the culture. Shoot, we only have 5 minutes left. What do you think? How do you think the Mesopotamians see a hero? What's a? What's that? You don't always need to be successful. It's okay to fail.
see it as like their itself, like that demigod itself, they put themselves can even make a mistake. So our self like human being
Yeah, so if he can make mistakes and sort of, transcend them or get by them, then we can as well, right? Maybe it allows. I think what makes heroes compelling is that you can see some of yourself in them, right? Or some of them in you, right? Or you want to. That's what makes heroes. That's why we want to watch and read things with heroes in them. And here we have one who makes mistakes but is able to carry on, right? And maybe learn from them somehow, right? What else? What else do we learn about heroes?
You can find a good adjective in the hero. They wanted to be like him. And another thing, I think they are very flexibility people that we should call them a hero because they live with other people in the same situation and in the same with the same lifestyle.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, I like that. I'm not going to paraphrase that. That's good. What else do you think? Maybe not even about Mesopotamians, but about what we think heroes are. What makes someone a hero? They what? They protect other people, yeah. Often they do. Okay. Okay, so they have the strength to sort of battle an enemy, but they also have the kind of perseverance not to give up, not to quit. I thought you were going to start singing the Mariah Carey song for a second there. Now you're all singing it in your head, aren't you? What else is a hero?
We can learn from how to communicate with each other and we can learn good adjectives from
Sure, right? So the hero in this case can be a model, right, for us, right, a role model. And so we can hopefully see something of ourselves in the hero, but we can also be inspired by what the hero does, right? In any sort of book or movie or myth you might want to imagine, the Sumerians are saying, here's what you should aspire to, right? If you want to be heroic, this is how you should do it, right? And I think we only have a minute or two here. I think it's very, very interesting the way that Mike Rugnetta told the story here, where Gilgamesh is not a hero because of his strength, right? He's a hero because of his limitation, right? He's a hero because of his humanity, right? It's not his strength that makes him heroic, right? It's the human part of him that is heroic, right?
Can we say that people who admired or ideologies for courage?
Say that one more time.
People who are like admired for courage.
Yeah, people who are admired for courage, right? And to be courageous, to be brave, is to kind of do something even when there's danger, right? Even when you might be negatively impacted by it, right? Look at the thing. You've all seen Avengers Endgame, right? No? Okay, plug your ears, Felicia. I don't want to spoil it for you. But at the end, with Iron Man, right? That's a pretty heroic act, right? And it's not because he's like so smart or technologically, it's not about all of his superhero qualities. It's about that courageous thing that he does that I won't say because I don't want to spoil it for Felicia. It's all about that thing, right? And it's a very human thing that he does, even though he is a regular human, Tony Stark, but it's a very human thing that he does, but a very courageous thing that he does. So his heroic moment is almost not about, it's not about his superhero thing, right? It's not about the Iron Man suit or how intelligent he is or anything like that. It's the human choice he makes, right? So it's interesting how we think about heroes as being strong and persevering and defeating evil, which they often do, but it's often the human side of them that makes them heroic, right? Not the strength, right? Not the superpowers. Yeah. Although that might not apply to Rick and Morty. I don't know. Okay. Any last things that we should talk about before we? No. We shouldn't talk about anything else.
Yeah, let's go back to like hunter-gatherers.
You want to go back to hunter-gatherers?
Yeah. I'm so fucking free.
What?
I'm so free.
Okay. All right.
You want some donut? I can get you.
What's that?
You want some donut? Get like with it. You want some donut?
I what?
Want some donut?
You want some donut?
Yeah.
Do I want some donut?
You want some donut?
No, I'm okay.
Okay, fine.
Okay. That is all for today. Have a nice afternoon. Come back tomorrow. A little bit about Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero's journey, and then more Sumeria stuff. Okay? That is it. See you later. Kenny's out the door, as is Felicia. Okay. See you guys.